Hey everybody, this is Mrs. Tolson with your updated review for the fossil record, Geologic History of Earth, and Evolutionary History and Relationships review. Um, this is going to be a little bit of a longer video than some of the other ones because there is a lot to cover, and some of it we did a while ago before vacation. A little bit at the end we haven't gone over yet, but we will go over that before the test. But if you want to start learning about it, you can do that now. I recommend that you have your notebook out or at least a pen and paper. That way you can write down some notes as you're going. You can always pause and rewind at any time. And if you have any questions, please come see me. Alright, just really quickly, some of the learning objectives for the three different sections for fossil record. Hopefully by the end you would be able to analyze and interpret data for patterns in the fossil record that show or document that different organisms existed, the diversity or the variety of different organisms, when organisms went extinct, and how they changed. All those things about the different life forms throughout the history of life on Earth. And under this last part, under the assumption that natural laws operate today as in the past, that just means we can assume that, if we understand what happens when an earthquake happens today, how it jumbles up the layers of rock, we could assume that when earthquakes happened millions of years ago, the same thing happened. When a volcano erupts today, it generates ash and lava. The same thing would have happened when volcanoes erupted millions and billions of years ago. So we make some assumptions that the way things are today, we can compare that to the way things used to be. The way things happen is similar. For Geologic History of Earth, you're expected to construct a scientific explanation based on evidence from rock strata or rock layers for how the geologic timescale is used to organize Earth's 4.6 billion year history. And we'll go over more of that as we go through these slides. And for Evolutionary History and Relationships, you'll be expected to apply scientific ideas in order to construct an explanation for the anatomical similarities or physical similarities and differences among modern organisms, so among organisms that are still alive today, and between modern or current organisms and fossil organisms or extinct organisms, to infer what kind of evolutionary relationships or common ancestry there might be between these organisms. So we started out fossil record by looking at a picture, and you were supposed to pick of this list of 7 statements which you thought were the 3 most accurate statements about fossils. And of this list, the 3 most accurate statements are that fossils tell a lot about how life forms have changed over time, because we can look at fossils from different periods of time and see what types of life forms used to be on Earth compared to what types of animals are here currently and what was here in between. The youngest fossils will always be found in the top layers of rock as long as the layers have not been disturbed. And the fossil record provides evidence of Earth's history. So a lot of what has happened on Earth, and a lot of the species, plant and animals, are no longer in existence. So by studying the fossil record, we have evidence of those things that are no longer on Earth today. Some of the vocabulary for this first fossil record section, we talked about chronological order, a lot about looking at fossils and looking at evidence. We want to put things in chronological order, which is when we arrange them in the order that they occurred, from oldest to youngest, or farthest in the past to most recently. An example of doing that is making a timeline. Fossils are just the preserved remains of organisms or imprints that show how long dead organisms lived and how their bodies were structured. So a fossil just doesn't have to be a bone or an actual piece of an organism, and it can be an imprint, an impression, a footprint. It could be a burrow. It could be fossilized animal poop. There's lots of different things that can be our fossils. The fossil record, it's not a document, but it's just the whole collection that includes all of the fossils that have been found, along with the rock layers in which they're found and in the order of appearance when they appeared on Earth. And it's not collected all in one place either. It's just that all the information has been collected and kind of put together, so scientists and people in general can understand what fossils have been found and in what rock layers they were found. Just an important note is that the fossil record does not include every organism that has ever lived, because not every organism makes a fossil. Sometimes things die and it's not in the exact right conditions, so a fossil isn't made. Fossils are mostly made of the hard parts of organisms, because those are the things that don't decay right away. Again, if the conditions are not just right, a fossil will not be made. So scientists believe that there are many, many, many species of plants and animals that we have no fossil evidence of. Sedimentary layers are the layers of rock that are deposited one on top of another in horizontal rows, and they can be distinguished from one another or told apart from each other based on their mineral content. So what was happening at that time in Earth's history affects kind of the color and composition of the rocks. And you can tell, like looking at this picture here of the Grand Canyon, you can definitely see these different colored layers. Those are different layers, rock layers or rock strata that were deposited at different periods of time in Earth's history. So extinction, when we talk about that, that's when a species no longer exists, when there's not even a single solitary member of that species still alive on Earth. And once an organism is extinct, it cannot come back from extinction. There is no coming back from that. Common ancestry, and I'll explain more about what this is, a cladogram, later on in this slideshow. But common ancestry is the concept or the idea or the that when organisms are descended from or share a single common ancestor, they will have some similarities or some things in common that can show that common ancestry. So when we talk about having similarities, a lot of that is tied to the fact that there is some common ancestor in the distant past, not recently, not like a great grandparent, but way, way, thousands, even millions of years ago. Diversity, or sometimes it's called biodiversity, describes a variety of different species of organisms. So in this picture here, there's a lot of different types of fish, there's different types of coral, so there's many different types of species of organisms, as well as the variety within each species. And for example, all humans don't look alike. Even though humans are all the same species, some are tall, some are short, some have light skin, some have dark skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, brown eyes. So there's a lot of variety there. Radioactive dating is one way to determine how old a fossil is, and it's a little bit complicated. Just know that radioactive dating is a technique that is used to determine how old rock is by looking at how much radioactive material is in the rock, okay, and its decay products. And doing this, scientists can get a number of years old. So this is a more specific dating process. So this is the kind of process that can tell you whether something is 10 million years old or 100 million years old or 300 million years old. You can't get like super specific. It's not going to be able to tell you like an exact number of years old, but it will give you a range of years old. Relative dating is a less accurate or less specific, I should say, type of dating. Is when scientists compare two fossils or two rock layers and just determine which is older or younger based on what layer it's in. So no actual date or age of the rock or fossil is determined. So in this picture here, this fossil or this skeleton here in this top layer is going to be younger than this one. This one will be younger than this one. So the fish is older than the other two. This one in the middle is older than this one, but younger than this one. So again, younger at the top, older at the bottom. If we're looking at relative dating, it can just tell us what's younger and older, but it cannot give us a specific age of that fossil or that layer. Some of the things we talked about is how can the fossil record give us clues about how climate and habitats have changed over time. Well, we know that plants and animals alive today have adapted to their climates and habitats, and the same is true for the past. So, where we find fossils can give us clues about the environment in the past when the organism lived there. For example, we talked about this in class, is if you find a fish fossil in what is now a desert, this is evidence that long ago there was once a body of water there. Okay? Because we know that fish live in the water now, we can assume, like we said on that earlier slide, we can make some assumptions. Fish live in the water now. We assume that fish have always lived in the water. So if we find evidence of a fish fossil, then that is proof that there used to be a body of water there. It's not reasonable to think that fish used to kind of walk around and live in the desert, millions of years ago. If the environment does change too much, though, and the organism can't adapt to it, then they will vanish from the fossil record and go extinct. So when we're looking at rock layers, if all of a sudden we no longer see fossils of a certain organism anymore, that can be an indication that that animal or plant is now extinct and is no longer living in that time period. So that's why we don't find any more fossils of it. What patterns did we notice in the fossil record? There are a few different patterns that we noticed when we did the data table and we looked at the timeline for Explorer number 1, the millions of years ago activity where we had the Jenga blocks that we put in order. We noticed that these early animals, the first ones, were very simple organisms and lived in the water. Okay, as time went on, organisms got bigger and more complex, and as time continued to go on, organisms moved from being not only in the water to having land animals, plants, land plants, animals that walked, animals that flew. So a big difference between these early organisms and modern organisms. And we can see that by looking at the fossil record. A couple different ways that fossils form is sometimes, again, we talked about when you can, the different types of fossils you can find is sometimes you can get an imprint when organisms are pressed between layers of rock, and so there's nothing left of the organism itself, it just leaves an impression of it. Sometimes things can be petrified or turned to stone when they're buried in dirt, and which eventually turns to rock. Water seeps into the bones and replaces it, and basically turns it into stone. And sometimes things are preserved whole. Animals are encased or enclosed in amber, ice, peat bogs, tar pits, anything that really slows down the decay process. So it allows the fossil to form. And sometimes in these scenarios, you can find a complete organism, which is very rare. It's very rare to find a complete fossil of an entire organism. I did show a picture in class of a baby woolly mammoth that had been found in ice, and it still had the hair and everything exactly as it had when it died. So that's a very rare situation. So, a very quick snapshot of how fossils form is you have a plant or an animal dies, it settles to the bottom here. Obviously this is a fish, so it settled to the bottom of this lake or ocean. Over time, sediments, which are small pieces of rock and dirt that enter this body of water, pile up over time. It becomes packed down and turns into rock. And again, this is over millions and millions of years. So layer upon layer forms, and in those layers you get sandwiched these fossil remains. So most fossils are found in sedimentary rock layers. We did this other Explorer activity, digging through the past, where we were digging in the sand for our pictures of fossils and kind of looking at some of the pieces of evidence that scientists find. Is that scientists can get information from like the type of rock that the organism is found in. Like, for example, if it was found in sandstone, that's evidence of either a desert environment or a riverbank, and those are two pretty different environments. So then we went further, and once you started to find the organisms that lived there, that could tell you, like there was one example where in this type of rock you found evidence of a cactus and a scorpion and a mouse. So that would indicate that that was a desert environment versus a riverbank. So scientists take a combination of the fossil evidence plus the type of rock that's found, and that can help determine what kind of habitat or what kind of environment was there at the time, what kind of organisms lived there. And a lot of times scientists would find, rather than this whole nice clamshell, would just find a fraction or a fragment. So it's a bit like a puzzle that scientists have to kind of take all this information and put it together and kind of figure out what is the story that that's telling us about Earth at that time, or that location at that time. We talked about stratigraphy, which is a very hard word to say, which is just a branch of geology, or the study of rocks, that is all about kind of putting rock layers in order according to their age, and looking at the information that it tells us. Um, and stratigraphy uses relative age dating. It doesn't tell us an exact age of the rock layer. It just is all about saying what's younger, what's older. The newest fossils are on top, oldest fossils are on the bottom. And there's something called the law of superposition. So the reason why we can say that the oldest fossils are in the bottom, it's not because I told you so. It's because the law of superposition states that as long as rock layers are not disturbed, for example by an earthquake or some other event, then the youngest layer is always going to be on the top, and the oldest will be on the bottom. Each layer is younger than the one beneath it and older than the one above it. So again, when you're explaining it, you should be using that law of superposition. Law of superposition tells us oldest layers are at the bottom, youngest layers are at the top, as long as they're undisturbed. So this picture shows disturbed rock layers. So the law of superposition says layers that are put down horizontally. Okay, so they're put down in straight rows across, left to right. So if there's evidence of a fault, which is what's shown here, or some kind of igneous intrusion or tilting that affects the rock layers, then we know that those events, whether it was the fault, the intrusion, or the tilting, would have to happen after the layers were formed. So if we look at this picture here, it looks like all of these layers here on this right hand side of the fault have shifted down. So if I could, but I can't with this picture, take and slide this side up, then this layer would line up with this here would line up with this here, this white would line up with this here, and so on. So the layers were there first, then the earthquake caused them to slip past each other. Absolute dating, radiometric dating. We didn't really go into much detail about this, but if you're just to explain a little bit what it means, if you've ever heard of half-life, radioactivity, radioactive elements, they break down at a certain speed or a certain rate or a certain period of time, and scientists know that. So they're able to look at how much of the original radioactive element is left and compare that to how much is left now, and then that helps them determine how old the rock layers are. So they compare, how much of the radioactive element is currently there versus how much it started with, and that helps them determine how many half-lives have gone by. So that can help them determine the age of that layer. But it's just the thing with radioactive dating or radiometric dating or absolute age dating, those are all three ways of saying the same thing, is it just gives you a number of years old that something is, versus just saying older or younger. So after fossil record, we move on to geologic history of Earth. A few more vocabulary terms. Geologic timescale just describes the timing and relationships of events that have occurred during Earth's history in order by relating or looking at stratigraphy, the study of rock layers, to time. So comparing kind of events to the rock layers and using that to create kind of one big history of Earth and what was going on at different periods of time. Rock strata is just another way of saying rock layers. It's a bed or layer of sedimentary rock that has approximately the same composition throughout, which just means it's made up of the same type of material throughout. Okay, so each layer denotes or indicates a certain period of time. Index fossils are fossils of organisms that existed for only a short period of time, and they're found all around the world, and these are very helpful to help identify a geologic period. Because they're lived for such a short period of time in Earth's history, they kind of mark these different periods in time. And one example we talked about is a trilobite. And again, the law of superposition, which just says rock layers are laid down horizontally, with older layers being laid down first and found near the bottom, and those are underneath the younger rock layers, which are found towards the top. So again, geologic time scale, scientists have studied layers of rock and they used them to build a timeline. And I know I showed this picture before with fossil record, but there's a lot of overlap between geologic time scale and fossil record. So using fossil evidence found in the different rock layers and determining their ages using radioactive dating, they can build this history of Earth. Okay, and again, you can tell different rock layers or strata apart because they look different, because they're made up of different types of sediment. Different types of material were in the atmosphere, were kind of being laid down during these different periods of time. So then there's a lot of overlap in the information between fossil record and geologic history of Earth, so there might be some repetition here, but sometimes hearing it a different way or looking at a different picture can help you understand it better. So again, law of superposition says that sediment is laid down horizontally like this, okay, stacked up in layers, with the oldest layers on the bottom and the youngest layers on the top, as long as the layers haven't been disturbed. So this says original orientation. So this is the way the rock layers were laid down, okay? Then, if we see now the layers are no longer lined up, or they're tilted, or something has happened, then this event, the tilting event, had to happen after the layers were formed. So they always form like this in nice, neat layers. Then if anything happens, it had to happen after they were formed. So this was one of the activities that we did. You had to look at this picture. And this is a little more complicated situation here, so we can see that, you know, the rock layers, but then something happened. There's a couple things going on here. It's not all nice and neat and tidy. So scientists can use the law of superposition to help them kind of straighten out this puzzle of what happened first. So in this image, what happened first was layer C formed, then layer B, then layer A, then D here, which is an igneous intrusion, so magma rose up from a vault of magma, okay, and it rose up towards the surface, and then lastly happened this fault. E is a crack caused by an earthquake. And how do we know that's the order? Okay, well, like we discussed in the previous slides, we know that rock layers are formed horizontally. So if we see anything, if there's anything that cuts through a layer, like this igneous intrusion or this fault, it has to have happened after the layers were formed. Okay? So we know that this igneous intrusion cuts through all three layers, C, B, and A. So C is lowest, it's down below, so C formed first, then B on top of it, then A. Then there was this igneous intrusion that moved up through all the way to the surface. And after the igneous intrusion, there was a fault. And we know the fault happened last because what it did is, we know it happened last because now nothing lines up on either side of the fault. The two sides of layer A don't line up. The two sides of layer B don't line up. The two parts of this igneous intrusion don't line up. And we can't see any evidence of layer C because it must be down here somewhere. So the evidence is that the layers don't line up, so this must have happened last. Okay, so you have to use some logic and reasoning to kind of explain your answer. And the law of superposition, which says that things form in horizontal rows or layers, and if something kind of messes up those layers, it has to have happened after the layers were formed. Fossils can be used to correlate or connect or compare rock layers found in different locations. So what does that mean? It means, again, that it shows a relationship or a connection between things, and in this case it's rock layers. Because a lot of times you get scientists comparing fossils and rock layers that they found in different parts of the world, where different events have been happening, and so they need to be able to kind of know what the different time periods are, because if layers are found in different places, they can't just say, well, this layer was on top of that one, because the layers were found in different spots. So if scientists find rock layers that are made of the same type of material, the same type of rock, and they contain the same type of fossils, the same kind of collection of fossils, like the um, faunal succession, faunal, yeah, I think that was what it was. Oh my gosh, I can't remember. So, but if they find the same collection of um, fossils and in the same type of rock, then they can infer that those layers formed at the same time. So this is very helpful when studying rock layers that are in different continents, um, or if erosion happens. So here you can see kind of you've got the same fossils in here, here, and here in these three locations. So scientists would say that these three rock layers were formed at the same time. So similarly here, we've got some of the rock layers here, there was erosion, so not all the rock layers are shown or present, but you can see that similar fossils are found in similar types of rock, so scientists are able to kind of line that up. So index fossils are a very special type of fossil because they can help scientists quickly determine the age of a rock layer. And this is because specific index fossils are found in specific periods of time. In order to be an index fossil, the following has to be true. The organism had to have existed for a relatively short period of time in Earth's history. That doesn't mean it had a lifespan of only like 2 or 3 years. It just means it's in the grand scheme of things in Earth's history. Maybe those types of fossils were only on Earth, or those types of organisms were only on Earth for a few million years or a short period of time. So if you find them in a rock layer, you know that that layer is from a very certain period of time. The organism has to be abundant. There has to be a lot of them. Okay, so they got to be pretty easy to find. And the organism has to be widely distributed, meaning it's found in all parts of the world. So that way, if you find it, anywhere you find it, you know what age that rock layer is. So we've got this picture here. It says in the diagram below, these four outcrops are four kind of sections or rock layer examples were found in four different places around the world. Which fossil could be an index fossil and why? So take a minute, you can pause the video and think about it. Can you answer this question and explain your answer? So pause for a second and see if you can figure it out based on what we did in class. You have this in your notebook where we did the stratigraphic profile. Okay, so the answer would be you need to look for a fossil where you can find more than one in the same layer, but it can't be in any other layers. Okay, so we've got this one here. This one, there's more than one in that one layer, but we can't use that one because it's found in other layers. Okay, that's this one here. We've got this one here. There's only one, there's not more than one, so we can't use that one. We've got this one here. Okay, there's multiple of these in this layer, but we can't use it because it's found in other layers. So fossil D here, this one, boom, 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 all four. Okay, there's multiple found in this layer, but it's not found in any other layers. So that's the index fossil because you've got more than one in the same layer. It's not found in any other layer. So we can use that one as an index fossil. So for evolutionary history and relationships, the vocabulary that we're looking at is anatomy. When we say the word anatomy, we're just talking about, we're studying the structure of animals and their parts. And we talked about anatomy of a cell back at the beginning of the year. It's when you're looking at the structure of something, how it's made, how it's put together. And if we're talking about anatomical, it's just relating to that body structure, something that has to do with some part of the body. Homologous structures, when we use the word homologous, it means similar. It doesn't mean it's exactly the same or identical. It means it's similar. You can see a lot of things that are alike, even if they're not exact. So homologous structures is something that's similar in position, meaning where it's located in the body, structure, what it looks like, or evolutionary origin, so where it came from. And so the presence of these homologous structures helps to support the idea of common ancestry, that organisms have a common ancestor. Evolutionary history is just talking about a sequence or an order of heritable or inherited changes that occur among species since the origin of life on Earth. So some of these characteristics that we have, they didn't just magically appear, they were inherited. They came from somewhere. And in this case, they came from some common ancestor. And when we look at these things, we can see how closely related organisms are in evolutionary history, depending upon their similarities. And a species is just a group of similar organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring. So there are many different species on Earth, and you'll talk more about kind of what species mean, I think, in 7th grade. But just in general, species is just a group of similar organisms. So I brought this up earlier in the fossil record when we talked about common ancestry, looking at one of these things, which is this tool that scientists use. It's called a cladogram or phylogenetic tree. It's a diagram that shows the relationship between organisms, and it can help to show which organisms are more closely related to each other. So in general, the closer that two organisms are on one of these cladograms, the more closely they're related. So if we look up here, birds and crocodiles are like right next to each other. They branch off right next to each other. So birds and crocodiles would be more closely related to each other than birds and amphibians, because birds are here and amphibians are way back over here. Okay? So the closer two things are, the more closely related they are. Primates would be more closely related to rodents and rabbits because they're right here. They branch off this same branch here off this main line than anything else. Okay? So if we look here, there's each of these branches that comes off. And each time something branches off, or at each one of these points here, it indicates the development of some new characteristic. Okay? And everything from here up has that characteristic. Everything from here down does not. So for example, if you look here where it says 4 limbs, everything from this point moving up here has 4 limbs. So it has 2 front legs and 2 back legs. Or in this case with the bird, it has 2 wings and 2 legs. So it has 4 limbs, it's just not arms and legs. So it has 4 limbs or 4 appendages. Down here, all the organisms, so everything on this cladogram, and there's, if we look back here, there could be a lot more things back here, but we're just not concerned with that. Everything on this cladogram shares one thing in common. They all have vertebrae. Okay, they all have some kind of backbone. Okay, for sharks, it's actually a backbone made of cartilage, because here we see bony skeleton. So sharks have a backbone, it's just not bony. From here forward, the skeletons are made up of bone. Okay, so and then what separates primates and rodents and rabbits from everything else is they have hair. Okay, so we'll talk, we haven't really talked a lot about this, but that's how you read these. It's just as you're looking up, each of these lines indicates something, some new development. Everything from here up has it, everything from here down does not. So some additional important terms that we've talked about is that a vertebrate is any animal that has a backbone. Okay, so most of what we're focusing on, organisms having common ancestry, are vertebrates. We're not comparing vertebrates so much to invertebrates. Adaptations is just a change in behavior, structure, or function of the parts of the body. So what the body parts look like, how do they work to help the organism be more suited to survive and thrive and do well in their environment. And we're going to talk a lot about limbs, like arms, legs, wings, flippers, etc. of an animal, because a lot of that, when you look at the limbs, you can see a lot of evidence of common ancestry. For example, in this picture, we are looking at the limbs of the 4 limbs, or the front limbs, of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. Okay, so in addition to the fossil record, scientists can look at homologous or similar structures to see if the organisms share a common ancestor. And if you look at all of these, and if you look at kind of the coloration of the different bones, all of these bones here, the bones that make the hand, the bone that make the toes here, the foot of the cat, the bones that make this flipper of the whale. You wouldn't think when you look at a flipper of a whale, you wouldn't realize that it almost looks like a hand inside there. You can't see it because it's covered up with the skin of the flipper. Same thing with the bat. The skin of the bat's wing is stretched over, and if you look, this looks like a thumb and 4 fingers, okay? And again, we've got these similar colored bones. We've got these 2 bones in the forearm, the lower leg. Here they are again in the flipper of the whale. They're kind of short and fat compared to these long skinny ones, but again, they're the same bones. These are the same. Oh, I skipped over these. These little yellow bones that make up your wrist. They're here too in the cat. They're here in the whale. They're here in the bat. We've got this upper arm bone, the humerus. Okay, here it is, here it is, here it is. So if we look, even though all of these limbs look different from the outside, from what we can see with the covering on it, when you look at the skeleton, they all are very similar. The arrangement of the bones is similar. The size and shape of them is a little bit different, but the way they're arranged in space is very similar. So that's proof of common ancestry, or that's evidence of common ancestry. So there's 3 main categories of homologous structures. One of the ones we just looked at, and we'll look at it a little more, is anatomical. What do the bones and the skeleton look like? What are some physical similarities? Again, anatomical homologies or anatomical similar structures are evidence of a common ancestor. Developmental homologies, when we look at what the organism looks like before birth. I mean, a lot of times, when different organisms are born, once they are born, they all look different. Like, you wouldn't say that a human being would look like a cow, or looks like a fish, or anything like that. But when you look at the embryos, very early stages, there are some similarities. And then molecular, when you look at the DNA or the genes, the closer together, the more similar the DNA is, the closer the evolutionary relationship. So again, we looked at some bones a minute ago. So we've got some other things to look at. So if we have similar bones in the forelimbs of mammals, reptiles, and birds, which shows that way back in history there was some common ancestor, and then one branch kind of branched off and became mammals, another branch branched off and became reptiles, and another branch branched off and became birds. So if you look at all of these organisms here, these are all, so bats, seals, dolphins, dogs, sheep, shrew, human, they're all mammals. And then we got birds and pterodactyls. Pterodactyls is an example of a dinosaur, so that would be a reptile. So they have similar bone structure, but then they evolve differently to do different things. So they evolve, some of these forelimbs or front limbs evolved to fly, some to swim, some to run, and some to grasp or hold on to things. Okay? So although there are similarities between the forelimbs of these animals, some are more closely related to each other. So for example, all of the mammals, which means the bat plus all of these other 6, are more closely related to each other because they're all mammals. They're more closely related to each other than they are to either the bird or the pterodactyl, which is a reptile. Okay? So a bat, even though this is a wing, a bat would be more closely related to a human than it would be to a bird. Okay, because bats and humans are both mammals, and if you look, the bone structure, the bone arrangement of the bat wing looks more like the human arm than it does the bird wing. The arrangement of the bones and everything. The fact that it looks like it has 5 fingers and everything. Some other examples of anatomical homologies: large skeleton, tusks, and trunk. So if you look at like this Asian elephant and African elephant, these are modern organisms. They're still alive. They are not extinct. They look very similar to the extinct woolly mammoth. So that shows evidence of common ancestry. So the woolly mammoth is extinct. Elephants, not extinct. Still alive. We can see them in zoos and on TV and everything. So another kind of homology that we look at, or similarities, is developmental. Okay, so when we look at embryos, when we look at organisms before they're born, when they're first developing inside their egg or inside the mother, we can see some similarities. like in this up here in this top row, this very early stage of development, we've got a fish, a salamander, a tortoise, a chick, hog, calf, rabbit, and human. Okay, calf is a baby cow. They all look pretty similar. I mean, not identical, but pretty similar. Then as the development continues, they start to differentiate. They start to look more and more like what they're going to look like when they're born. Okay? And again, the more closely related they are, like these four right here, the hog, the calf, the rabbit, and the human, these are all mammals. So even here in this second stage, they all look pretty similar. Okay? And then as they get closer and closer to being born, then they start differentiating more and more and looking less and less alike. Okay? But this similarity in appearance when they're in this developmental stage is an example that there is some common ancestry. And again, the closer the relationship, the more similar. DNA, so molecular homology, is if we're comparing DNA or genes, the more the DNA of two species have in common, the more closely they're related. And there's a lot of these DNA kits you can send out to see kind of your DNA makeup, to see what parts of the world you come from, and your ancestors, your more recent ancestors, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents. But when we look here, so we've got like chimpanzee DNA and human DNA, they're 98% the same. So there is a huge amount of similarity between human DNA and chimpanzee DNA. Human DNA and mouse DNA, you can look here, they're not so similar. Okay, so again, we're more closely related to chimpanzees than we are to mice. Okay? And now people always ask, is it true that we have 50% same DNA as a banana? Well, all DNA shows some similarity because it's made up of the same chemical compounds. It's made up of the same stuff. What makes us different is the way that stuff is arranged. So no matter what the organism is, it's going to have some similarities in the DNA. It's just how that DNA is arranged. What's the order? One thing that was kind of surprising to scientists, and we talked about it a little bit in class, sometimes you can't just tell by looking at something how closely it's related. So if you looked at these three animals really quickly, I would automatically assume that this elephant, shrew, and the mouse were more closely related to each other than to this elephant. But when scientists looked at the DNA, they found that the elephant and the elephant shrew actually have more DNA in common with each other than the elephant, shrew, and the mouse. So the elephant, shrew, and the elephant, they're not super closely related. I mean, they're not like cousins or anything. But in evolutionary history, these two, the elephant, shrew, and the elephant, are more closely related to each other than the elephant, shrew, and the mouse. So you can't always tell just by looking how closely related something is. So to follow up on that, just because structures look similar does not mean that the organisms share a common ancestor. Okay, sometimes organisms have similar structures because they live in the same type of environment and they have to be able to do the same type of things in order to survive and thrive. So a way to tell if structures are similar, so we've talked about homologous structures which have similar anatomy. There's something else called analogous structures. So sometimes organisms have structures that look the same, not because they have a common ancestor, but again, because they are living in similar environments. So if something's homologous, it has similar anatomy, similar bone structure, does different functions like we just looked at, whether it's walking or flying or swimming or grasping. And they develop in animals that are related, okay, so share a common ancestor. Analogous structures, and we'll look at a slide in a second, they have different anatomy, so the way the bones are arranged is not really that similar. They do similar functions, like flying, so the wing of an insect, the wing of a bird, the wing of a bat, they all have wings, but that does not mean they have a common ancestor. So these type of structures develop in animals that aren't related. It's not inherited from a common ancestor. So again, these are homologous. It's a similar type of bone. So if we look at these pictures and it's color-coded, so they have similar bones, they're arranged in a similar way. Again, similar does not mean identical or exact. It means they're pretty close. They're pretty alike. You can tell the bones are arranged in the same organization, even though the size and shape of the bones is different. So bones are arranged in a similar way. They have different functions. This one's for grasping or grabbing onto things. This one's for swimming. This one's for flying. This one's for walking. So even though they do slightly different jobs, the bones are arranged in a similar way. This is evidence of a common ancestor. Analogous structures, we have different anatomy. So the bones are arranged differently. So we've got a bat, a bird, a pterodactyl, and an insect. So the bones are arranged differently. And there's no bones at all here in the insect. They all have wings. They have the same function. They're all wings used for flying. But these are not inherited from a common ancestor. Okay? And it can be a little tricky because the bird and the bat wings are analogous as wings. Okay? So birds and bats, they didn't inherit wings from a common ancestor. But they are homologous as forelimbs. So birds and bats did inherit forelimbs or front limbs from a very distant ancestor with forelimbs, okay, or front limbs. And then again, it branched off to become mammals versus birds, okay. So these are not. So birds and bats did not inherit wings from a common ancestor. They inherited front limbs or forelimbs from an ancestor that eventually evolved into wings because they shared similar habitats or environments. And lastly, we talked a little bit about sometimes scientists think something is extinct, but it really isn't. So for a long time, scientists thought this fish, the coelacanth, was extinct. It's a deep water fish, and they hadn't seen it for a long time, so they declared it extinct. And then in 1938, it was rediscovered, quote unquote. And one thing they did realize when they rediscovered it is that this current coelacanth looks very similar, almost identical, to the fossil version of the coelacanth. And the fact that they still look alike gives scientists some evidence that their environment has not changed very much over time. Because in most instances, organisms, if their environment changes, they either adapt or change to survive in that new environment, or they go extinct. So the fact that this organism hasn't changed very much indicates that the environment that it lives in has not changed a huge amount over time. And that's the end of this slideshow, the end of this review. If you have any questions, feel free to review the video. I know it's a longer video. Come see me if you have any questions. Thank you.